Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on the scientific process, and specifically going through and discussing and breaking this down so we understand the material for the rest of the year. Let's get started on this next video. So what is the scientific method, and what is science? Well, all it is a logical way of thinking. And its definition, this definition of science, is an organization or a way of gathering and analyzing evidence about the natural world around you. And we can change the ideas based on testing and evidence. So what we're thinking is if you develop a scientific process here, or if you develop scientific thinking, you're using logical reasoning skills and understand all aspects of the world around you. And when we commonly think of the scientific method, we can think about it via this graphic here. We can see an initial observation. After that initial observation, we're going to see a hypothesis. We can go through and see experiment. The following step is going to be observation and analysis of data. And then lastly, we're going to see interpretation, followed by conclusion. We can see that this process is going to be cyclical. We can see that we can use this process if our hypothesis is not supported. We can go back to the beginning of this, make a new observation, and go through and try to identify what makes this new experiment or old experiment valid or invalid. So what we want to go through and do is we're thinking about this scientific methodology via this process here. And we want to understand that the process is cyclical. Now, if we look at this graphic here, let's go through and look at a tangible story and a tangible scenario where we're going through and looking at grass. What we can see here is we have two different sets of grass. We're going to go through and water the grass, provide it the same amount of sunlight, same kind of water, the same quantity of water, except one set of grass is going to go through and get fertilizer. So what can we conclude from this observation here? Well, if we look at this story, let's go through and read a story here of the grass going through and growing and try to break down the scientific process via this story. So if we go through and looking at this, the first part of the story or the first chapter is going to be observing and asking questions. So you have location A and location B. Now, researchers observed that marsh grass grows taller in some places than others. This observation led to the question, why do marsh grasses grow at different places and different heights in these different places? Now, the scientists are going to go through and researchers inferred that something limits grass growth in some places. This is where we infer and hypothesize here. It could be any environmental factors such as temperature, sunlight, water, nutrients, and it's based on their previous knowledge of salt grasses. They propose a hypothesis that marsh grass growth is limited by the available nitrogen. After this, researchers select similar plots of marsh grasses. All the plots had similar plant density, soil type, input of fresh water, etc. Plots were divided into control and experimental groups. This is designing a controlled experiment, which we've gone through and talked about in class. Now, our control group is going to consist of the grasses that do not get fertilizer. They're not given nitrogen, which is the main component of that fertilizer. The experimental group is going to be given fertilizer, so nitrogen is going to be added. So what we can see, the researchers added nitrogen fertilizer to the experimental plots, and then they observed the growth of the marsh grass in both the experimental and control plots. Later, they're going to go through and compare the control and the experimental group. What we're going to see is a difference in height here. They're going to go through and measure the marsh grasses. The researchers sampled all the plots throughout the growing season. They measured growth rates, plant sizes, and analyzed the chemical compositions of the living leaves. Now, after they go through and do this, they're going to draw their conclusion. They're going to go through and graph height of the grasses. It's going to be height of grass on the y-axis versus time in weeks. And what they're going to see is the control group that's represented by the blue line and the experimental group. It's the line represented by the red. So, data from all plots were compared and evaluated by statistical tests. Data analysis confirmed that marsh grasses in the experimental plots with additional nitrogen did in fact grow taller and larger than the controls. They hypothesized that their predictions were supported. So what can we conclude based on that story that we just went through and read about? Well, we can conclude that the grass that receives more nitrogen or fertilizer is going to grow taller, and that nitrogen is going to be a growth factor. So what we just went through, it was the scientific method, and I gave it to you in a story so that way we could have a tangible observation and a tangible thing that we're going through and looking at. First part of the scientific method for this course, and it's going to be different depending upon what course that you take, but we can use this general graphic here, is we're going to make an observation, we're going to question, hypothesize, test and design a controlled experiment, analyze, and that's followed up by a conclusion. You're going to learn it in different ways and depending upon what class that you take, but this is going to be the basis and the foundation for the scientific method. So let's go through the first part here, observe and question. An observation is anything detected with the senses. This is going to include hearing, sight, smelling, taste, etc. Now, we're going to use research, and all research is it's using resources to formulate our hypothesis. We're going to make an observation, we're going to formulate a question, and we're going to go through and research that to go through and try to design that experiment. So no matter what you observe, you need to find out what is already known so that way you can come up with the best hypothesis for your question. Now after this, we're going to go through and form our hypothesis. A hypothesis is a possible answer to a scientific question, but it isn't just an answer. It must be based on scientific knowledge and it must be logical, and it's going to later be tested. So we're going to use what we think is going to happen and test. We're either going to see if the hypothesis is refuted or supported by evidence. So one, we're going to make a prediction based on a hypothesis. Prediction is just a statement that tells what will happen under certain conditions. And then we're going to gather evidence to test the hypothesis. So evidence is any type of data that either agrees or disagrees with our prediction or our hypothesis. It can be numbers, it can be data, quantitative, or it can be qualitative, and we'll discuss that in class. All right. Lastly here, we're going to analyze, and all an analysis is a detailed examination of the results from testing. So we're going to analyze, and we're going to determine if the evidence that we've gathered proves or disproves the hypothesis. We're going to use communication here to go through and draw a conclusion. So we're going to communicate what we've learned. Is your hypothesis supported or refuted? Is your experiment valid? We're going to determine possible sources of errors, and then we're going to go through and formulate our conclusion. Now, it's important for us to understand that process in a controlled experiment has three components, and we've already kind of talked about this in class. These are the three key vocabulary words that you have to go through and really fundamentally understand. We have our independent variable. This is also called the manipulated variable. It's what we change in the experiment. So, in the grass, we created an experimental group. We added fertilizer, which fundamentally we added nitrogen. The other one is going to be the dependent variable, which is also called the responding variable. This is the variable observed and changes in response to the independent variable. It's basically what we're going to go through and measure. Okay? So that was the control group, which we're going to talk about in a second, that we use to compare the heights of the grasses. Now, lastly here, this is what we call the control group, which I just mentioned. It is exposed to the same conditions as the experimental group, except for the independent variable. And this is key because what it does is it allows us to get a valid experiment and allows us to go through and compare the different types of grasses or the different types of sets of scenarios in our experiment. Now, lastly here, a key thing that we have to understand. Scientific theory is not the same as a hypothesis. When we talk about a theory is a well-tested explanation that unifies a broad range of observations and hypotheses and that enables scientists to make accurate predictions about new situations. So, hypothesis is basically a guess, and then we use that guess based on the research that we conduct to go through and test. Theory is after we've gone through, tested, analyzed, and concluded, we use that scientific evidence to go through and create what we call a theory. And theories can be proven or disproven, but at any point, if we ever show evidence that that does not support the theory anymore, we can come up with a new explanation or a new theory for that scenario provided by that new evidence. Okay, so the goal of this video is to give you a fundamental understanding of the scientific method, provide you with a real-world example or a story that we went through and looked at in this video, so that way we can have a tangible scenario, and for us to break down what each of these vocabulary words mean and what the three important vocabulary words, the three important things of the scientific method are. All right, so this is going to be the end of the video. And at the end of the video, we're going to go through the Did You Learn? So did you learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you learn about the scientific process? Did you learn about how scientists use this process and the parts associated with this process? And lastly here, did you learn about the difference between a theory and a hypothesis? This is going to be the end of the video. We'll see you all in class tomorrow.